Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Spacepower Podcast, where we explore the evolving frontiers of national defense and innovation. I'm your host, Bill Wolf, the president and founder of the Space Force Association, and today we're honored to have with us Colonel Richard Martin, Deputy Commander of Marine Forces Space Command, or MARFORSPACE, joining us to talk about the Marine Corps role in the space domain, its operational evolution, and what the future holds for Marines in orbit and beyond. Colonel Martin, welcome to the show.
Yeah, hey Bill. Thanks for having me on board today. It's really good to be here and talk with you about Mar Space.
And I really appreciate you taking time. I know how busy it is and how small the Corps is. However, the Corps is much larger than the Space Force. So really appreciate you taking time. Let's start with some context though. The Marine Corps has always been agile and forward thinking. How did the Corps first begin engaging with the space domain?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I appreciate you kicking off with this one because I think the history here is definitely important context and understanding where we are as a service in the space domain today. So it's good to talk to riff on that one just for a little bit. Any conversation that comes up about Space Marines, I always duly recognize what you could probably, or what we should probably recognize as the original Space Marine astronaut, Colonel John Glenn, and his orbit around Earth in 1962, right? So when people think about the modern quote Space Marine, they tend to think about people like us, but he and many others like him, decades back, are the ones who actually can claim that moniker as we kind of throw it around today, kind of tongue in cheek. That was back in '62. That legacy continues with the Marine Corps through the decades, having I think 30 some odd assigned to the astronaut program over all those years, and two actually on active duty today, which is pretty cool. So I always joke with my wife, if I can come back in another life, hopefully I'll get to be an astronaut because it's fascinating. But they're out there doing that. Those are the folks who actually rate the moniker of Space Marines. But to your point, there's been Marines advocating for the importance of space in our operations for decades. There were those types writing articles in professional journals in the 80s and the 90s in which Marines were writing about the importance of being, well versed in the domain so that we would understand the role of space in our terrestrial operations. We were we were making space professionals at the Naval Postgraduate School as early as the 1980s. That's still something that continues today that I'll come back to in a little bit. But those Marines earn a master's in space systems operations and get an additional occupational specialty of space operations officer. And again, that they were as far back as the late part of the last century, the 1980s and 90s. Those folks would be circulating in various parts of the service, not deliberately being placed in positions to support tactical operations. But there's always been a small number of experts interspersed throughout the service over decades, forming what I've heard termed as a cadre of believers for a long time, right?
Yeah.
And then in the early and the mid 2000s, there were a couple of what I would call catalyzing circumstances that began to compel the service to take a more deliberate approach to putting space expertise on a more operational footing for the service. The first one was and as these dates are pretty precise, I think, as oral histories kind of go. These are about as close as I can get it. First was in circa 2001. When then Secretary Rumsfeld chaired a commission that was chartered by the fiscal year 2000, I think, National Defense Authorization Act, to essentially report on the U.S.'s organization and management of space activities in support of national security. That report, some of your listeners that have a long history here would remember that report warning of what it called a space Pearl Harbor. And that imagined that the devastation to our way of war as well as our way of life that could be caused by attacks on commercial military space constellations and such. And so along with that admonition, it also directed the department to focus on the development of a space cadre, which is to say there was an identified and an imperative need there to professionalize the cadre of space professionals more so than they probably had enjoyed in the past or to that point. And I think at the time, The article shows evidence, or the report shows evidence that that was aimed, I think, largely focused on the Air Force, because that's where the majority of the cadre in space was. But
Mhm.
the implication was that all services would take note and take action. So that was really the impetus for the Marine Corps to begin considering, I think, deliberately, as department level directives have a way of doing, considering more deliberately a purposeful placement of some of the space professionals who have formal training in the right places in the service, and then start to create opportunities for other Marines to attend, shorter courses and earn additional skill designators as what we call now Space Operations Staff Officer. That skill set at the time, and at least to the point of near history, that was limited to what they picked up in the classroom and was self-study and whatnot. But that was meant to at least, seed at least a modicum of space familiarity across more of the force. And then the second catalyst really came during Operation Iraqi Freedom, and that was when there began to be Army space support teams assigned to Marine Expeditionary Force headquarters staffs that were in theater in Iraq during that conflict. That was the first time, really, I think, those who were there could remember when effectively Marine commanders then were having someone demonstrate the utility of having space experts available at tactical echelons to help incorporate space-based capabilities into actual combat and warfighting operations in ways that really had not been seen at that visceral level theretofore. So after several years of that exposure, as OIF marched on and commanders began to advocate for the need for a similar skill set inside Marine formations, right? The commanders and the staffs who had the benefit of the ARST over those years said, we see what that does for us. We see the utility that imbues in our operations, and we want more of that. And preferably, we'd like to have Marines who can speak that language and translate it into Marine operations, right? So those two catalysts, I think, the Space Pearl Harbor memo, as it were, and then the operational front row seat into what space operations expertise could mean for a tactical echelon, really was the thing that got us going there as a service in the near history. Going a little bit further there and kind of getting closer to the now, in the early to mid 2010s, the first NPS grad that I talked about earlier appeared as an assigned billet at the Marine Expeditionary Force level, which that really is sort of the high tactical level of our operational units. And at the same time, there was a handful of reserve component Marines who were assigned to STRATCOM, which prior to 2019 and the advent of SpaceCom and MARFORSPACE, or SpaceCom 2.0, MARFORSPACE, that was kind of the day on, stay on cadre of space professionals that we were able to train pretty intensively in Army and Space Force curricula, space operations planning, space, considerations for operations and such. They were the ones who could be consistently relied on to show up at major service level operations or exercises rather, and effectively present what that ARST experience was for those commanders early in Iraq, and then making it more readily available and apparent as far as utility goes to contemporary and modern day Marines, as it were. So then in 2019, as all your listeners, I'm sure, are aware, SpaceCom reemerges and Space Force stands up. And then the following year, the Commandant of the Marine Corps directs that MARFORSPACE activates and serve as SpaceCom's Marine service component. And then finally, in 2022, the Marine Corps established the Information Maneuver Occupational Field. And I can talk a little bit about that more later, perhaps, in some of the other topics we'll cover and why that's relevant. But that was meant to professionalize, among other corners of information warfare, meant to professionalize the space cadre by creating the Maritime Space Officer as a primary military occupational specialty, which means that, unlike before, the service isn't relegating space expertise to what is effectively a collateral duty in its personnel. So that standardizes training, that places them at specific and deliberate echelons with a specific intent to be able to recreate the vision of what the service always, for a long time, recognized it needs to make sure that space operations in the space domain are effectively integrated into our operations. That's the short history, sparing you a lot of some of the detail about how we got to where we are today in terms of the force.
No, thanks so much. I appreciate that context and very detailed historical perspective. So thanks for that. And what I forgot to ask is, and going in light of that as well, tell me about your background, your history and how you ended up being the deputy commander at MARFORSPACE.
Yeah, well, like a lot of cases in that kind of circumstance, it's just good timing. Like everybody, a lot of your audience can appreciate. I know you can too. I'm a career intel officer, actually. I've done that for about 25 years. In the past several years, I've been more exposed to the service's information warfare corner. So
Mhm.
I've been at Marfor Space for a little bit over a year as the deputy commander. Prior to that, I was in Okinawa at 3 Marine Expeditionary Force.
Nice.
Immediately prior to this assignment, I was the CO of the MEF Information Group,
Gotcha.
it's effectively the tactical information warfare unit at the MEF level, and that organization is charged with planning, coordinating, and integrating non-kinetic effects planning, space included. So that's cyber information operations in space, and so
Hmm.
that was where my first real dabble and experience with the space domain and what it means for operations for the Marine Corps kind of came into being there. But prior to that, a year still on Okinawa was the Division G2 as an intel officer, and 2 years before that, I was in headquarters Marine Corps at the Pentagon at the Deputy Commandant for Information, who that's the three-star deputy commandant whose portfolio includes space as well as the other information-related capabilities. So I was spent a year doing resource management, the POM cycle, learning about the
Hmm.
information warfare side of the services program of record, and then spent another year in the intel division there as the operations officer. So really the last 5 or 6 years has been more of an information warfare focus for me, and the space thing is really taken off in the last couple, and that's how I got to be decom at Marfor Space.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that perspective too. And I have discussions with folks about obviously the criticality of the Marine Corps and how it does a phenomenal job being the service to help the maritime domain, the Navy, get to the land domain represented by the Army. And so when you talk about the Marine Expeditionary Force, and you talk about a carrier battle group, for example, Marines play a pivotal role in transiting between the two domains of maritime and land. And then a lot of people then start to make the comparison between what the Space Force is doing, and that it's of course subjugated to the Department of the Air Force because it's a smaller needed service at this point. But it's not a direct comparison because the Space Force is really not a transitory, it doesn't transit between the air domain and the space domain. It is solely dedicated on the single domain of space. And then, of course, what you're describing is the support needed to execute on the other domains. So if I think about the five domains in cyber, land, air, maritime, and space, obviously space needs to support the other domains. And then sometimes space needs to ensure freedom of action in its domain. So I just wanted to call attention to that because it's great talking to a Marine senior leader and just, getting their perspective on, on what that could look like and what that means to the service. And then, of course, talking about the criticality of space on the terrestrial service and what the service is doing here on the Earth.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really fair characterization. You're right in the way you described the Marine Corps, right? Historically and still today, very much a naval part of the naval force. You'll hear me talk later on in the show, probably. I think the expeditionary character of the service really is what sets us apart in a lot of ways. And crisis response from the sea, worldwide reach and deployability, and then some of the more contemporary concepts that we may get to shortly here really kind of put us in the frame of Amphibious force and readiness, crisis response force and readiness, absolutely. But then the ability to, fight from the sea, from the maritime domain, alongside our Navy counterparts and partners, and then be able to apply some of that expeditionary character to other domains where we can contribute to some dominance on the battle space or
Yeah.
wherever, however that might be needed. So, but to your point, the Space Force is clearly the preeminent warfighter in the space domain. But I would offer, that what's one of the things I've learned in the year and change I've been at Spacecom is that everybody, every service who's got a space component or has a role to play in space warfighting in the space domain has to think holistically about the all domain aspect of what we're doing, right? Those
Hmm.
those battles and advantage is not gained in a single domain alone. We've got to be flexible across all services to meet the kind of challenges that are around the corner and in a lot of ways here with us right now today.
Yep, spot on. And I appreciate that. You mentioned the ARS earlier on, and I remember I was part of the AFST, the Air Force Space Support Team, because I think they were trying to do the same thing where they were just standing up the Space Weapon School, and I'd just come out of the Space Weapon School in '01 and deployed in '02 to support operations in Afghanistan. And it was interesting because it was kind of one of those things where they're like, hey, you just go down range and see where you can help out. And of course, it was about, providing the information necessary to support maneuver, operations and maneuver. And as technology becomes more prevalent on the battle space, obviously connectivity becomes critical. And if you don't have that connectivity, everything can go south very fast. Speaking of current operations, how does space integrate into modern Marine Corps concepts like the stand-in force or crisis response operations?
Yeah, that's another good one. And those two conversations are still very much at the front of the service conversation about who we are and what we're contributing to the joint force. So, just a quick little bit of a background context on stand-in force. That's a concept born from Force Design 2030. At this point, 2019, 2018 timeframe. As part of our force design, that's as it is for all services, force design is iterative as a process, but 2030 was a pretty significant inflection point for us, force design 2030. So that concept of a stand-in force, as well as crisis response, which is still very much center mass in terms of what the Marine Corps provides to the nation under the Joint Force, that uniquely Marine Corps crisis response capability. But both the stand-in force concept and our traditional role of crisis response both rely on a force that is adept at operating in the space domain. Just for the listeners' context, stand-in force, we call that SIF for short. It's an operating concept that acknowledges the emergence of what's called or sometimes referenced to be long-range precision strike regime as a very capable element of some of our adversaries' arsenals that can challenge what has been a long-standing ability for the Joint Force to project power anywhere in the world and then sustain it for long periods without real significant threat to speak of. The SIF concept, recognizing in the last decade that the character of war, to your point, is changing. The battle space is becoming more dangerous, and we can't always rely on the same kind of advantages that we did in decades past. Well, the SIF concept seeks to place the Marine Corps inside those adversary weapons engagement zones and help the Joint Force retain that advantage despite what the adversary can bring to bear in terms of the counter intervention platforms that you see proliferating today. So operating inside weapons engagement zones or performing in a crisis response role, either one, on the modern battlefield requires an introduction of new and enhanced technology that rely on the space domain for their capability. And, I didn't mention this earlier, but historically, despite some of that space-specific history I gave, you can generalize the Marine Corps' relationship with the space domain as being voracious, like much of the Joint Force, voracious consumers of space-based capabilities.
That's
A
right.
lot of our systems and a lot of our technology and a lot of the concepts that we rely on, both in the past as well as in the present and around the corner in the future, rely on data and capability
Mhm.
from space to be able to win and operate and to succeed. They inherently demand the access to space-based capabilities and, to your point, the mission assurance and the connections that we rely on to access them, right? And so as these concepts become more say complex is the word for it, but as they keep pace with the evolving character of war and the evolving and frankly more dangerous and more uncertain operating environment, no doubt whatsoever that relationship and that interoperability with the space domain is going to be an integral part of those two concepts, whether it's SIF or whether it's global crisis response.
Hmm.
As your audience knows, space domains, we like to say at MARFORSPACE, as we talk to service audience, space's domain is the fabric into which all the joint warfighting functions are woven, and it's absolutely going to feature more and more prominently in our service concepts and the equipment and the people, particularly, that we use to realize those things.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good perspective. As we're talking, I can't help but think about warfighting culture. And recently, the Secretary of War talked about, the warfighting ethos. And if you could just provide context about the culture of the Marine Corps with regard to, every Marine or rifleman and how you've seen that play out through your career, and then just provide observation, if you can, about how that impacts or you're seeing that culture either coincide with other services culture or opportunities to learn from each other's culture.
Yeah, you're right. War fighting is and has always been at the heart of what the Marine Corps is as a service. I mean, that's one of the war fighting mentality, um, the expeditionary character, the crisis response character of what we advertise and what we are as a service really fundamentally just distills down to the warfighting ethos. Fundamentally, that's just unequivocal. The fun thing to watch is really how the war fighting imperative that we've always, understood and operated by, but that is just becoming that continues to be and becomes more and more prevalent. And I think a lot of the concepts and a lot of the planning, the execution imperatives across the whole of the joint force, especially from where we sit, really is focused on fighting and winning, whatever that
Yeah.
requires. And if that means bending your comfortability around a domain that you're less familiar with or haven't spent a lot of time thinking about, or as I said earlier, kind of focusing not just on what is the traditional dominion of something like of an organization like the Space Force in space, and then pointing it down toward the terrestrial warfighter and how that applies, and
Hmm.
how that mentality translates. And for the Marine Corps, alternatively, typically have been focused on amphibious operations and dominating terrestrial battlefields, and now having to reconcile the reality that those wars aren't going to be won without, like I said, fighting in, through, and from space. And so that to your point, that ethos and that mentality is showing wide applicability and frankly a very wide embrace, which is really cool to see.
Thank you for that context. Appreciate that. And that you mentioned the changing character of war. So let's talk about how has the changing character of war, especially in the information and cyber domains,
Yeah.
shaped the Marine Corps' approach to space.
Yeah, and again, I'll go back and just spend a half a minute here on the context because it does matter when you trace the history back. You can find the origin of that story in the 2016 Marine Operating Concept. That was essentially planning guidance that the service publishes, periodically over the years. But that one came out in 2016. That was the one that described how the Marine Corps would fight in the 21st century warfare environment. One of the foundational principles described in that document was that effectively, and I think to your point, 21st century warfare was going to be much more difficult than previous decades of warfare had been. And if nothing else, at least much more uncertain in terms of, complex technologies that were going to be more widely proliferated and easy for potential adversaries to adopt, that information would be used as a weapon, and that information itself would become a warfighting domain, and that and this is, I think, something that resonates especially for Marines because we come from a combined arms culture. But the new combined arms would be delivered from the cyber and the space domains, as well as some of those, the traditional air, sea, and land posture, right? So I think back then that the service was very clear-eyed in its understanding that the cyber and space domains were going to be immutable aspects of the operating environment, that those, in those spaces, including information operations and cognitive terrain, and that we had some ground to cover before we could begin to achieve the advantages let alone the relative warfighting prowess in those domains that we had earned in the land and the sea and the air up to that point. So that 2016 Marine operating concept was pretty prophetic, I think. And that's really what has animated the service to be as explicit as it has been about the importance of training our force, our people, for that mindset and equipping and professionalizing them in the right ways, and to get to and stay on the what I call the jagged frontier of space and cyber and information related technology and capabilities, and work really hard, I think, to incorporate them into an all domain warfighting approach.
Hmm.
It starts with our concepts. It most
Hmm.
importantly, it manifests in our people and their mindsets, and it continues with our capability development. And it translates, if we get it right, to realizing the version of ourselves that we knew more than a decade ago now, almost a decade ago, that we need to become. And I
Yeah.
think the success on today's battlefield, and certainly those of tomorrow, just demands nothing less than that.
No, that's a great point. And what I really appreciate is the deliberate nature in which you create a quote unquote all domain expert. So can you talk a little bit about the amount of time spent in a typical career on tactically focused missions, and then the amount of time needed based on the new technology that's being created to talk about the operational level or the integrated warfare needs to be able to talk across the service boundaries and say, hey, we need to communicate more effectively and consistently to ensure we provide the operational effects that we know we're going to need.
Yeah, you're right. I think to some extent, some of the conversations about information warfare and space, more so probably than anything else, cyber and information operations, more approachable. I think, these days, because those have been in part of the conversation and certainly part of the operationalization of the force
Mhm.
and the department over the years. Space still, I think, is still a little bit fringe, I think, for
Yeah,
the service to some extent, aside from
sure.
those who are actually operating in those corners as a matter of just their trade. But as esoteric as some of these conversations can feel for people, all this stuff is a combined arms approach, or
Yeah.
it lends itself to that combined arms approach very, very easily. When you start to translate it into those terms and speak in those familiar terms in that vernacular, combined arms is what I would call the lingua franca of the Marine Corps, and that's just something that resonates pretty quickly with them, pretty effectively. But I think I mentioned earlier, the advent of the information maneuver field was the service's acknowledgement that yes, this absolutely deserves investment in terms of professionalization. We have to get it out of the collateral duty and sort of the backbench of the afterthought, and then start to develop a capable and widely experienced cadre that is flexible enough and able enough to apply those capabilities at for tactical level for tactical gains at the tactical level. To your point, I think, or to your question, there's an incredible amount of investment from the service on getting that right, and a really strong imperative. So Deputy Commandant for Information is leading that charge, supported by the whole of the service, the Force Development Enterprise at Headquarters Marine Corps. There's absolutely an imperative to get that right, and a lot of energy going toward making sure that the force is well trained, has the right mindset, and is positioned with the right experiences to make ourselves the better version of what we're going to need for the 21st century.
Perfect. You know, speaking of operational level of war, it's interesting. A test I like to do, or I like to do when I was on active duty, was I'd go into um, different services camps, and I'd ask a simple question. As we're doing this operational level planning, is space part of the minimum force package? And it was interesting, and I just bring that up for context because it would be interesting to see how long the response would take, because it was oftentimes it wasn't very fast. It wasn't absolutely it is, then a table slam. And then the following question is always, yeah, tell me how. So speaking of telling us how, let's talk about MARFORSPACE Space itself. Let's talk about your mission and how do you contribute to US Spacecom?
Absolutely. Yeah, MARFORSPACE, that's the thrust of the conversation. So always glad to tell that story a little bit. I think in basic terms, you can think about it in as far as Two things. We support USSPACECOM's operational requirements, and we provide support and enhancement to the Marine Corps' ability to operate in and contribute to the space domain, primarily through what we call our role as a pathfinder for the service. And that definitely includes, education and folding some of the insight and expertise that we're gaining here at Spacecom back into the service so that everybody in the Marine Corps is able to answer that question you might put to them that you just referenced more quickly, more ably, more completely, right? And I'll get to some of that here in a moment. But those are the two things. The operational imperative for Spacecom is its service component, is its Marine component, and then what I call the moral imperative to fold that placement access, insight, and experience back to the service to make it a more capable force in the space domain. So I'll take those in two different descriptors here, two different conversations. The support to Spacecom is fundamentally as a component why we exist, right? So that includes certainly the standard issue responsibilities of a service component to a geographic combatant commander, or in this case, it's astrographic, as far as Spacecom is concerned. But something that's unique about what we have is an operational element assigned to MARFORSPACE staff. That is the Marine Space Detachment, or MSD for shorthand. We're one of only a handful of MARFOR components, Marine components, that actually have an operational element assigned to us directly that way, as opposed to, larger, more units at a different tactical echelon that may be considered part of forces provided and so forth. We've got that MSD attached to us. We force generate it. We put it into service to support Spacecom's operational requirements. And the key here, and I've hinted at this before, I think earlier in the cast, what we consider the central contribution and what I tell audiences that I talk to, or whenever we can tell the story, what is special about the Marine Corps in space and Spacecom is that the MSD brings that expeditionary character of the Marine Corps to Spacecom's mission. It's a terrestrial maneuver element that can deploy on short notice, go just about anywhere Spacecom needs us to be, and then bring a range of capabilities within the detachment to bear. So you can see the analogy, right? I mean, it hews to exactly what the service does with the Joint Force is what the Marine Space Detachment and MARFORSPACE is doing for Spacecom. The commander or the command for Joint Force space operations. The MSD is definitely unique in the Marine Corps. There are Marines at tactical echelons and other places in the service that are capable of conducting space operations, but no actual unit of Marines focused solely on and uniquely equipped for the space mission. And because we're in direct support of Spacecom, we're able to explore the opportunities across all the space mission areas. And that flexibility is what really makes it fun to be us. That gives us access to both partnerships and resources across Spacecom enterprise that can enhance our ability to contribute in the most operationally relevant ways possible, which I think is, frankly, for any service member, for any service, no matter what uniform you wear, that fundamental question, what's the important and helpful thing around here, is the one we ask ourselves too. So agility across space-related authorities by virtue of our placement alongside Spacecom, access to equipment and training that is unique to our placement here, partnerships like those with Army's 1st Space Brigade, which is a critical enabler for us and has been part of our maturation as a component and as a operational element. The Space Force's Rapid Response Branch and the Space Force's Space Domain Awareness Tools Applications Processing Lab, otherwise known as SDA TAP Lab, really enhance our operational posture and our reach. So all that I just described is what you could call, like I said before, the operational imperative to Spacecom. We also talk about that moral imperative that we have to turn over and look back at the service and look across to our Marines in the Fleet Marine Force and the Marine Corps as a service, and fold all that experience and pathfinding effort back into the Marine Corps to make them more capable in the space domain. That means supporting Marine Corps operations where we can by deploying alongside them where that's feasible and we're capable of doing that, and employing capability to enhance their operations and their effectiveness in the space domain. That means offering the space cadre in the Marine Corps that is, again, like I said, relatively young as far as the years go, but that unique training opportunity, and that we can bring some of them back here and imbue our insight and our expertise in the Joint Force space operations into them and make them more capable. So And that's aimed at the Fleet Marine Force at the operator level. There's certainly the implication there too that or the mandate there too, that we help the service. We're one of the loud voices that helps the service formulate smart strategy and policy as it regards or as it relates to the space domain and space operations, and certainly popping the hood here at MARFORSPACE and helping the force development enterprise understand what's in the realm of the possible in terms of what a space capability could mean for the Marine Corps in the future. So that's the nutshell of the two missions. We can dive on any of those as much as you want.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And again, it's it's always interesting to see the services evolve again based on the changing nature of warfare and realizing that, hey, we've got to make a plan. We got to skate to the puck, as the saying goes, and make sure that we're prepared to ensure, operational objectives, tactical objectives can be met. So speaking of what you've just described, let's talk about the future outlook in terms of what the advice is for the next wave and looking ahead. What's the vision? What's your interpretation of the vision for the future of Marines in support of the ensuring freedom of action in the space domain, ensuring you get the capabilities you need from space to execute your terrestrial mission? And what advice would you give to young Marines interested in this domain?
Yeah, that's a good question. We ponder that one quite a bit. I would say my vision and my this is just Rich's perspective, right? My vision, in the truest sense of that word, is that the Marine Corps is one day known for its ability to contribute to operations in the space domain on par with our track record in the other four domains, right? It wasn't that long ago, for example, that we first waded into the cyber domain and made a service-wide concerted effort to elevate our game in cyberspace. And I think the potential, and we've done well there. I mean, there's plenty of examples in which there's been a real difference made from marine contributions to the cyber domain in ways that we didn't imagine, 10 years ago, but are
Hmm.
fully on display and being realized and repeated every day now. Um, I think the potential in the space domain offers a very similar analogy. MARFORSPACE, for its part, is on the leading edge of exploring and identifying what's in the realm of the possible, like I mentioned earlier, for the wider Marine Corps to contribute. And as long as we as a service continue to ask that fundamental question, to your point, I think you said it well a minute ago, skating to the puck. What's the same question about our role in the space domain as we ask about our contribution to the joint force? What's the most operationally relevant thing we can do here? And I think our ability to make a difference in this domain is only going to go evolve, and it's only going to be limited, frankly, by our willingness as a service to try. Um, as I mentioned earlier, I think because it's probably the least familiar of the domains in a lot of ways for a large part of the force. Sometimes it's hard to conceive of what we can do in the possible, right? Or as the possible.
Hmm.
You and I were talking earlier before we started recording, about how do you think about what the near future and the deep future is, right? And that book I
Hmm.
mentioned by Bled and Bowen called War in Space. That's an interesting book as it applies, helps people think about contemporary and current warfighting concepts as we understand them in the domains in which we're familiar, but then teaches them how to think about that in terms of the space domain and how they need to be imaginative and how they need to think about those things. I think he uses a term in that book, he references the new littorals. And that stuck out to me as a very helpful analogy and in terms of how Marines can think about what this domain is going to mean for us as a service in the future. If we can think about those concepts that we are fighting through now and fighting with now, much of which depends on our expeditionary character, how that contributes to really sort of the home field advantage, or at least the advantage that we can provide the joint force because of our expertise and our just affinity for operating in the littorals and the terrestrial domains. There's a world in which that could be, as again to your point, with my futurist hat on. There's a world and a way Marines can think about what that means for us and the new littorals that space will represent. And once you put it in that context, it's really not hard to make the leap about what's in the realm of the possible. So I think that's an interesting way to look at it. But At the end of the day, the unique expeditionary character that I've mentioned a few times that the Marine Corps is known for, that it just continues to be part of the Joint Force answer to some of the nation's most pressing security challenges. And I think that's going to be what continues to define the Marine Corps' utility for the Joint Force to be able to fight and win in space. And being part of MARFORSPACE, helping chart that course is really, really gratifying and rewarding. I've just got incredible teammates here who, some of the critical mass in terms of the expertise and the services space cadre is here with me on this team. And frankly, it's just the best thing I do is be able to provide the influence and do some enabling where I can and just watch them chart that course and help us understand what's next for us as a service. And to your other question, my advice to young Marines is the same as my advice to every Marine, frankly. It's to be relentlessly curious about how your role in the Marine Corps relies on or contributes to the space fight. It's that simple. Learn about it. Learn how the warfighting function you serve, whatever it could be, can either be strengthened by a deeper appreciation of the role that space plays in it, or how it and you can contribute your warfighting function to enhancing the Marine Corps space operations. Everyone, as we've talked about earlier, everyone on the battlefield fights in, from, or through space. Um, the sharper every Marine makes their understanding of the space domain, the better we're going to be postured to win. You can read about space, you can talk to your local space Marine, your maritime space officer. If you're at the tactical formation, if you're in the Joint Force, you can find someone who knows one and ask those questions and understand it better. Classes are offered, some of the stuff here offered through the National Space Security Institute that gives people a really good soak, and the breadth and scope of the challenge are always good places to go. And anytime I find someone in the Marine Corps who's even remotely curious about what space means for them and what it's going to mean for us collectively, I try to pull them in and encourage them to go to those classes, read those books, talk to those people, and just better understand how they fit in and how it fits in ultimately. And then if there's listeners there who are wearing MARPAT, if you're interested in making a career switch to space, you can talk to your monitor and check out the Marine Administrative Messages, MAR admins that solicit for that every year. And definitely, invitation is always open. If you're interested in learning more about MARFORSPACE and what it's doing for the Fleet Marine Force and for Spacecom, then just get in touch. You can find us out there. We're always happy to talk. That's my thought on that one.
Yeah, that's a good thought. And I guarantee, and that's what it's so funny because we're in basically the second space age. First
Yeah,
space age took place in the 60s. We're in the second space age now. And there's nothing more unifying and exciting than looking out at the infinite of space and realizing the potential and the opportunities. There's no more exciting time to be involved in the space domain and ensure freedom of action in the domain. No one wants a war that starts or extends into space,
fact.
but we all have to be prepared for what that could look like to ensure we maintain that freedom of action in the domain. So, Colonel Martin, thank you for your leadership and for sharing your insights. It's clear that the Marine Corps is not just realizing the criticality of the space domain, but it's also helping to shape how it interacts with the domain by defining its needs, its operational needs, and then talking about how it can achieve its tactical and operational objectives. So, and just as kind of as another thought for folks out there who want to learn more, not everyone can join the Marine Corps. Not everyone can join the Space Force, but everyone can join the Space Force Association. So if you've not done so already, think about becoming a member at ussfa.org, signing up and volunteering and helping to create this narrative and share the narrative and learn more about it. So I really appreciate your perspective today, sir. Any closing thoughts?
No, Bill, I really appreciate the chance to sit with you today and talk about space and tell the MARFORSPACE and the Marine Corps story in the space domain. So really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks very much.
Thank you, sir. And to our listeners, stay tuned, stay sharp, and keep looking beyond the horizon. Have a great Space Force day. Semper Supra. Bye now. Let me stop this recording. Where is it? There we go. And if you've not had a chance to sign up for the Space Power Conference, the third annual Space Power Conference, please go to attendspacepower.org and sign up today. For those of you in the Colorado Springs area and are available on the 6th of November, we are excited to once again host the Guardian Industry Nights, which will take place at the Peterson Hub on November 6th at about 1700. We look forward to seeing many of you out at that location. Until next time, Semper Supra.